4, 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Art of Move podcast with myself, Anthony Manuel, my good friend, Dr. William Raybar. We're still out here in the Canadian Rockies trying to find the ground unified theory of human movement biomechanics and everything else that comes along with the human experience as a whole. We're kind of branching out. So if you're used to us just talking about biomechanics, well, we still are. We're talking a lot about biomechanics today, but we're talking about consciousness. We're talking about the nature of life, reality, and the human experience as a whole. So today we're going to bounce off just a couple of videos that Will had pulled up. We're going to talk a little bit about Stu McGill. And Will, why don't you share with everyone what you've kind of pulled up here for us and some of the things that you've been looking into and thinking about lately?
Okay, so this is going to be Stu McGill, and it's really going to be about the debate around whether to be a neutral spine or can you flex during lifting. And it goes bigger than that, though. It goes more broadly. Is lifting the best way to rehab yourself? Because I think that, one, it's extrapolated just in the air of, fitness and biomechanics, that lifting is the best way to do things, to get more powerful, to rehab. It's used for everything. And it's also studied the most. It's what science views in its lens the most, okay? Especially when it's applied to strength and conditioning, and a lot of physios are using it. Again, I'm probably going to be straw man there. Like, no, it's not. It's clamshells and band external rotations and, FRC, how to move each joint. And I love all that, okay? Maybe I don't, but the point is,
you see that there's a specific application, but maybe it's overused as an application. And I think what I'm hearing is like everyone is putting things through a resistance training and linear movement lens, and the sort of lever system setup of kinesiology, where we were looking at like joints as levers and different things. We're putting everything through that lens, and so all the studies are around strength and conditioning and movement practice. It's around that lens of maybe a less sophisticated look at the human body in terms of how it moves. We've talked a lot about how most of this research doesn't account for the force transference of fascia. It doesn't account for the spiral dynamics of different locomotive patterns. It's looking at linear lifting, sagittal and frontal plane movement in the human body, and not accounting for a lot of other movement realities that happen. So
exactly. So where the debate is right now is can you flex during a lift? Should you keep a neutral spine? Should you anterior tilt? Should you posterior tilt your pelvis? I think there's massive amounts of confusion over what happens. The Stu McGill model is really the most popular. You see Squat U doing it all the time, and that is a stability model, almost the antithesis of what we're going for, which is rotary, which is movement, which is pressure wave, which is energy through the body. Okay, so I do see that the lifting lens is brought into everything. Okay, so that goes to rehab, strength and conditioning, and how to fix your body. So I do think that in the air, there's a thought that if you get a bigger squat, everything's going to be extrapolated to that. You're going to be healthier. Okay, so it's a good way to be healthier. And I think the average person does think that. It's a good way to build muscle, and it's a good way to be stronger in your sport. So it does everything. Deadlifting, squatting, and a lot of the research-based physios and chiropractors and sports med go towards this angle, okay? But is there a lot of research towards this? Is it pointing that way? I'm not sure, okay? So I think in the air, people think it is. But I think we're going to see today that it's not, okay? And we're going to see through a debate with Andrew Locke, who is a McGill guy. He rehabs under the McGill system, versus Greg Lehman. This is everyone, the research-based physio chiropractor. He's he's one of the higher ups, okay? So a lot of them have the academic crush on this guy. And he's done a lot of good work, right? He is the movement optimist guy, the don't give people nocebo. You've heard this before. Nocebo is don't tell people you can't do movements, because every movement's fine as long as you progressively overload it, okay? So where the McGill model differs is that there's a particular way to do things, and that is to keep the spine relatively neutral or in neutral as you lift, okay? And again, he looks at it through the lifting lens always, okay, and extrapolates that into everything to do with rehab. But to keep the spine in neutral so that people don't get disc herniations, or when they do, keeping the spine in neutral is a good idea. And I agree with that. Okay. But there's much more nuance to it. So let's listen to a little bit of the debate here. And I'm going to pull up random clips because I didn't have time to exactly edit them, but we'll bounce off them. And there's a lot of telling tales within the debate here. Okay. So anything to say about that?
I'll just take a second to define the nocebo thing a little bit for those who aren't familiar with the term. And movement optimism is this idea, like you alluded to, that any training can be done in a safe and effective manner with no negative consequences, as long as you are cognizant of load management and progressive overload. So if you don't exceed your capacity to recover, if you train within, safe limitations of progressive overload, and you don't like sacrifice joint integrity as you're training, you can do basically anything. You can do the heavier Jefferson curls that's progressively built up to. You can do a lot of different things, and it won't injure you. This is, of course, one of the arguments against a biomechanics informed approach to training, which asserts that if you train in a linear way, it will, or like in with barbells and with different traditional strategies, you might develop negative compensations in your movement patterns because you're training your nervous system and your system in general to to optimize your movement in this particular way. There's the specific adaptations to impose demands. They're saying that there are bad movements to do gets in people's heads, and it stops people from training, and it stops people from doing exercise because they're too freaked out about, should I actually do this movement? Is it going to hurt me? Is it going to cause an injury? Is it going to make me less efficient? So that's the sort of, basically, I think there's biomechanists or the niche alternate biomechanics sphere that's saying, actually, there is a correct way to move, and we should do our own training to optimize for that. And then there are movement optimists that are saying it doesn't matter what you want to do. You can do any movement. There are no negative consequences, just as long as you manage your load intelligently.
Exactly. And they don't believe that there is a optimal way to move through nature. Okay. They believe as long as you progressively overload, you're good to go. Okay. So it's really the blueprint that makes the difference, right? We do think that there is an optimal way to move according to nature. Spiral patterns, rotary patterns, spinal engine, being in the back chain, pressure waves through the body. This is much different than, as long as you progressive overload the movement, you're good. And if they don't even go with movement either, they're just like stabilize, and then you're good to go. Like as long as you progressively overload it, you're good to go. Okay. I may be straw manning slightly there, but it's close.
And when we're talking about optimal, we're saying maybe the most mechanically efficient in terms of how our body is actually put together, in terms of all of the factors, including the fascia, including the connective tissue and the bones. And like, we're looking at the reason that we are a biomechanics podcast is we're looking at the mechanical realities of what's happening. And that's kind of what interests us, right? So if you're looking at the most efficient mechanical way to move, you have to look at the body and assume that there is a more and a less efficient way to move. And if you optimize for that efficiency, then you will have to train a certain way. And training in other ways, like barbell lifts, like linear lifts, like conventional weightlifting, will cause inefficiencies in your movement patterns because of the adaptations that you're having. So that's sort of the position we've asserted over 80 episodes of The Art of Move. So let's listen to this. We got Greg Lehman and Andrew Locke. What's a little bit of background about this clip?
So they're debating deadlift technique and low back pain. Okay, and again, you'll kind of see throughout this whole thing that it's all over the place because one, they extrapolate technique, pain, and rehab and they intermix them when they're three different things, right? In my opinion. And I'm gonna play it and you'll kind of see, and we'll go as we play along here. So sorry, to give a little bit of context here. Andrew Locke is the big guy here. He's a world record holder, I believe, in powerlifting. You can see he's a massive guy. He wears a giant chain on his neck. He's basically saying that there is an optimal way to lift for technique. And he invokes, he's like, I'm the strongest guy. train the strongest guys in the world, so I know, plus science and physiology say that there's an optimal way to lift. And Greg Lehman's like, yeah, that's nice, but you could just progressively overload here, and there's a difference between technique and the cause of pain. Okay, so that's the background. And Greg Lehman's about to come back with his comeback.
Can you pause for a second? Because I can't
Yeah.
really hear. I can't really hear what he's saying. Is he saying there's a difference between technique and the cause of pain?
Yeah, so he's saying the research doesn't know if there's a difference between the technique and cause of pain. And that's kind of why I'm playing this, right? Like, again, in the air, it's supposed to be known that we already know this within the research. And we, being the science-based research, already knows this. But they don't. Actually, they have no, like, with all the research being funneled towards this area, they still don't know if that's the case. If lifting is preventing injury or even causing the injuries. So I'm going to play it once more, maybe. Did you hear that?
Yeah, so he does agree that there's an optimal technique for performance, but that research isn't asserting that there is an optimal point to eliminate pain or limit pain.
Exactly. So there's no research that says that basically that technique will eliminate pain. I'm going to play it one more time so you can hear it from him. What we don't have a lot of research on is the technique to minimize pain, long-term pain. So it's pretty funny because in this debate, Andrew Locke goes pretty aggressive at Greg Lehman, and he does say he's like he's like basically I'm that world's best lifter. I work with the world's best lifters, therefore I have a lot of credibility in this field, right? And you'll see this kind of attitude being displayed everywhere. I work with athletes, therefore I know what I'm talking about, right? Or I have this lifting technique. Are you there, or did you cut off? Yeah, I believe either I cut off or Anthony cut off there. Anyway, you'll see this a lot in the research-based field and in the fitness community that basically if you work with athletes, you have more credibility. That shouldn't be the case so much, right? So I think that there is something to working with athletes if you're actually changing their mechanics. So you'll see a lot of this from functional patterns. You'll see a lot of this from the Weck method guys. I know Connor Moves works with Olympic wrestler, I can't remember his name right now, Jordan Burroughs. And you can see the movement difference within the athlete as they move. Same with Naudi and his fighter. I can't remember his name, but he's worked with Jeremy Stevens and he works with a Bellator fighter, I believe. And you can see their technique within their movement, okay? Where a lot of the lifters, they will work with an athlete and they'll just be like, the power's there. You got more powerful because your strength increased. So your squat went from 300 to 400, therefore you will be a better athlete, right? So again, there's a lot of confusion between athletics, pain, longevity, how deadlifts, squats, heavy lifts transform into actual motions within the body, okay? And the rehabilitation process. These are all different things that need to be separated, and there's a massive amount of confusion between all of them. And as we just heard Greg Lehman say, there's not a lot known about the lifting technique and the long-term pain.
It's kind of interesting too, because even the idea of a optimal technique for performance, you would think isn't necessarily a thing if you factor in for different torso lengths and lever lengths and in the length of legs and everything. Like I remember seeing a lot of T Nation articles when I was like a young budding lifter about like how tall guys can squat and deadlift effectively because they have these longer levers, right? That they have to accommodate for. So an optimal technique for my, 5'8", very compact, proportionate skeletal structure is going to be different from like a lanky 6'4" dude who's bending over way more and has to move the weight a longer distance. Like that alone is like, well, there are different mechanical realities. So how can you assume an optimal technique for every human body and every lever length? The other thing is there's this idea, even in powerlifting, of neurological efficiency. Pavel Tsautsolin, the Russian powerlifting coach, had this term "grease the groove," which is you're greasing this neurological pattern so that you can become more effective at the pattern. It's technique. You are becoming more effective at firing your nervous system and recruiting motor units in the sequence to optimize the efficiency of your movement pattern while you're lifting this weight. Like a deadlift is a specific pattern. So if you're optimizing your nervous system to fire in that particular sequence, wouldn't that have an impact on your other movement outside of the lift? Like if you're optimizing and like deadlifts are a huge neurological input. Lifting 400, 500, 600 pounds off the ground is a massive demand on the nervous system and trying to recruit motor units. Wouldn't that show up in your other patterns if you're becoming extremely efficient at firing in that particular sequence?
Yeah, not to mention, does it mess up, I think, let's say Goda would say your columns would get wider. You're tending to widen your base because that's where you find your support in lifting, right? And then there's the fact that what is your proof? So a lot of these guys, the proof is the research, right? And that's all they'll look at. Both of these guys, Andrew Locke and Greg Lehman, the proof is the research. So they're just arguing between the research and maybe a little bit of anecdote, but it's mostly research. And that's what they'll stick to on both camps. So they'll look at the same research, like Greg Lehman said there. Reasonable people can look at the same research and come to different conclusions. But also, I think reasonable people can extrapolate mechanics, like engineering mechanics, mechanical principles that you can observe, and make logical inferences about what's happening or what should happen according to mechanical principles of observation. Okay, through observation, I should say, right? But they don't go there. They only go to what the research says. Okay, so I'm going to play another clip here. And did you have anything else to say about that one?
No. What's the background on the next clip?
I'm not sure.
We're pulling up random clips and going from there.
Exactly.
For the moment episode.
It is, absolutely. Okay, so let's play this one here.
Most comfortable there. And yet, what I don't understand is when people focus on the spine here. So what Andrew's saying is, I agree with, get into the position where your hips or where the primary mover can do most of the work and have the load closest to you. And often with some people, that's why you will see people lifting heavy loads over 700 pounds with a very flexed spine, right? The fact, like, that's what I mean about.
So did you hear that? That's interesting. Okay, so make the hips your prime mover. I like that, right? So hips versus the back, but a lot of times you will observe really heavy lifters lifting with a rounded spine, whether that comes from the lumbar spine or thoracic spine. I think, mechanically it should come from the thoracic spine first, and you'll see that with a Atlas stone, right? You'll see the upper back round before the low back. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because the prime mover should be your hips. I think they're both in agreement here. However, the disagreement is how much you should be able to flex in the lift itself through the lumbar spine. But I actually don't think that they really can see in live time where the flexion is actually coming from specifically.
Like, you don't think you can observe a deadlift and see what part of the spine is flexing, or what's the thing you think they can't observe?
I think they can observe it grossly, but they can't observe it perfectly at moment to moment in the segment itself. Okay, so they can't see if it's coming from T12 or L2.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so that would take very sophisticated equipment and very delicate equipment in a lab. I believe they probably could do it, but I don't think they can do it in movement. They could probably only do it in lifting and only very specialized equipment. And I don't think there is a ton of research on that, right? So that's where that is right now. I'm going to keep playing.
But quibbling over like 80 degrees of flexion or 50 degrees of flexion is silly. Like that's not really the variable that we should be focusing on, right? And then when we look at the spine kinematic research, we do see that people who lift heavy loads, right, do flex their spinal line, and we do have to be careful with using anecdote data here, which Andrew did, but it's fine because that's kind of all that we have. Because I can name people who lift very heavy loads and they don't really care about.
So did you hear about that? Like they only have anecdote data, right? So they don't even have hard data on this, according to Greg Lehman, about the actual spinal flexion, like we were saying before, right? But which segments actually spinal flex and how much. So basically he's saying we shouldn't really quibble about the amount of flexion because we don't even have the data on it. We should be worried more about other principles that go ahead of that, like lifting from your hips, right?
Right.
Or getting more motion into your hips. I'm kind of extrapolating that from what he's saying, but that makes sense to me, right? So it's also interesting. I want to point out where they say they don't have research. Again, number one, they don't have research on where the spinal flexion and how much spinal flexion should come from the lumbar spine, or how much does come from the lumbar spine during a lift. And I believe the only research that's out there is McGill with pig spines, flexing and extending pig spines, right? So they're unsure about how much spinal flexion is actually okay in the lumbar spine. And the overarching question is, why only flexion? Like, why do we care so much about flexion during lifting? Because again, that's a specialized thing. But that's where all the research is going, and they don't even know how much. Like, with all the research that's there and all the resources that are put towards it, they still don't know.
Well, this is, I mean, when you're talking about research, there is a lot of research on lifting, right? But this spinal flexion debate, why do you think it matters?
I really think it shouldn't matter that much, but it does, because that's where all the resources are going, and that's where all the thought is. Okay, so like amongst research-based clinicians, physios, chiropractors, you can see the debate still there. It's like I saw a post by a really popular physio on Instagram, and they're like, it was like a burning witch meme, and it's like the witch was spinal flexing, and it's like that's going against the grain now, is allowing for spinal flexion, allowing people to do just Jefferson curls. You see it in ATG actually, right? It's like, look, I can spinal flex. It's a theme you're seeing everywhere. Like, there's no doubt about it, right? In the fitness industry. But to me, it's a very shallow debate, because it's missing the point of energy movement through the body, spinal engine, pressure wave. All that's thrown out the window, and it's frontal plane flexion and sagittal plane flexion and extension is the important debate. However, it is important to lifters, and here we're having a lifting debate because that's where all the research and all the topics are, okay? And basically the crowd is looking towards this, and the research is looking towards this, and they still don't know.
I mean, it's funny because like gymnasts, for example, have been doing spinal flexion stuff in the frontal plane for ages, for like a gazillion years. There was this old thing where it's like, we do J curls like we breathe, like it's just an omnipresent reality of what we do in our training, because you do want to, like, for gymnasts, they do want to have strength and length, they do want to have these positions. Gymnastics is a specific thing on its own. It's a very specialized movement practice on its own. But like, gymnasts have known like the answer to this debate for a gazillion years. It's like, you do just progressively load it, it's fine. Like you're trying to actually have access to these ranges and the ability to flex in these ranges. Strength in gymnastics is a totally different skill. It's a totally different application than trying to maximally lift 600, 700 pounds off the ground. But I would assume that you would still want to like, if your spine did bend, I would assume that you would want a certain level of flexion and extension durability and resilience if you're lifting that much amount of weight. Like I find it very, very difficult to maintain a neutral spine anything after 400 pounds, or at least I did when I was powerlifting, right? Anything after 400 pounds, my thoracic would start to round quite a bit, or when I was fatigued at the end of like a heavier set, it would start to round. And that was my focus. It was maintain stability and integrity in my lumbar, brace the shit out of my core so I didn't lose my spinal position. But if I rounded a little bit, of course, the effect of that was like 10 years of deadlifting like that gave me a kyphosis that just in the last year, I've started to reverse a little bit. So I had a thoracic kyphosis that was like chronic. It impeded my airway. It impeded my breathing. And now I'm only just starting to now, after a year of doing some more biomechanics informed training and breathing exercises, just starting to flatten out that excessive curve in my T-spine.
So there's so much nuance to this, actually. Okay, so you mentioned the gymnasts who should be able to Jefferson curl all the way over and have that range of motion because they need it in their sport. The lifters don't need as much because, I mean, they're just going in a smaller range of motion. However, it's more important because they're lifting heavier weight. Now, I'm going to tell you a rehab story that I've seen in particular, okay, where somebody hurt
sharing your screen real quick too.
Oh, yeah. No problem. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a rehab story that's happened to me or a patient of mine, patient X, okay? And they've hurt themselves years back. They had what they thought was a disc herniation confirmed by MRI, even though I don't trust that much we'll get to that in another episode. But they had it confirmed by MRI a couple of years ago every few months. So they probably have 6 weeks of good, pain-free movement, and they bike a lot and hike a lot, and then they have 3 or 4 weeks of pain, 6 weeks of good movement, 3 or 4 weeks of pain, right? And the rehab they got was to avoid flexion because that is going to put pressure on the disc, okay? But it is also going to scare you into doing so in your rehab you're not doing any flexion because their physio told them not to do it, but in real life they're going to have to flex fast. Okay, because they bike. What do you think is going to happen? They're gonna be avoiding and scared of flexion, and safety is one of the number one things, if not the number one thing. Your central nervous system has to know, and your body has to be safe with where you're going. So they were flexing no matter what, but they weren't doing it in the rehab scenario. They were given the nocebo. They were told, you can't do this. This is going to be bad for your back. They came into me. They told me it's bad for my back. I can't do this. I'm like, no. We're going to rehab back into it slowly. Okay. So even in my world, I do encounter this in a rehab setting. However, the rehab setting is not the lifting setting, and the lifters and the research guys extrapolate the lifting back into rehab. You see how that works? So again, we have to extrapolate and switch and parse out what is what. The lifting, the specialized sports that you need it in, the rehab back from an injury, and what is the blueprint to begin with? Why are we even focusing on this? Okay. So I'm only focusing on
standard are you rehabilitating to?
Exactly. So again, if you're rehabbing back towards everything is okay as long as you progressively overload it, then yes, flexion and extension in the sagittal plane is very important. To me, the hips move in a circular fashion. As you move, the spine waves. So I'm rehabbing towards locomotion using that model. Spinal engine, pressure wave, pressure dynamics throughout the body, and positioning the joints and levers to be in the right position. And that's on top of actually like more of an FRC style where, and I'm talking rehab right now, where I bring them back to, can you control each joint? Do you have even an awareness of where your pelvis is in space? So I don't like FRC in the long term. I think people can do it too much just to do it, almost like lifting. But in the short term, I love it because it brings awareness to an area. So for instance, again, that same patient that had the issue with their back, I get them to extend and flex their pelvis. So I have the skeleton right here, right? The pelvis right here. And they were shifted forward with an anterior tilt, and they were told to go on the anterior tilt, okay? But with a forward shifted pelvis. So that's going to take the joints of the spine and bang them together on a joint that's already hot, already inflamed, okay? So the easy fix was, do you know what back chain is? Push your pelvis back. They're like, oh, it stops hurting, right? Mechanically, so easy. So it's like this, right? And then I'm like, now, if you go back and you flex your pelvis forward, so you do a posterior tilt, it's going to bring the joints apart so that your joints come apart. So going in the back chain and going into posterior tilt maximally brings the joints apart in the back. Those are the zygapophyseal joints. It may put a little bit more pressure. So this is a single disc here. So it may, like, here's the back of the spine. So if I go back and I separate these, see these joints right here? If I separate them, they come apart, and that's flexing. Okay? The disc might get a little bit more pressure. But it all depends on what is actually sensitive would dictate what you do. So being very precise with your motions has a lot to do with the very beginning of rehab. However, everybody wants to be like, this is the best way to do it. A posterior tilt or an anterior tilt with your hips back. Or some people are like, no, it's a neutral tilt with the hips straight in line with your pelvis, or sorry, with your ribs, right? Like the straight up canister approach.
Yeah.
But it's different when you're in pain because you have sensitive tissues sometimes, or sometimes it could be neurological, but let's say it's sensitive tissues exactly. You have to play into those sensitive tissues. So again, let's say it's my disc that is a problem, flexion is going to be a problem. Now what I have to do is I have to extend and get the pressure off the disc. It's going to put more pressure on the joints. If you have a problem with both, you're pretty screwed. But you can dump a little bit of load into your joints because it's a less sensitive tissue and a less important tissue, I guess you can say, for most people. And that will reduce the load on the disc temporarily and allow for a little bit of healing so that you can go back to neutral afterwards or go back to whatever tilt suits you. However, it's different when you already have pain compared to not having pain, compared to lifting when you're fine, compared to rehabbing towards running. So to make it less confusing, I like to be when tissues are not sensitive and when they're not in pain, I like to be in back chain. I like to have a slight anterior tilt. And that puts the joints together in the back here. The zygapophyseal joints, the actual joints of your spine come together. And it gives you a nice lumbar curve. However, if you're sensitive there, if you already have arthritis, if you have an issue with inflammation in those joints, you have to do something else. So there's so much nuance to this. And everyone just wants to be like, this is the best, this is the best, this is the best.
There's no one way, right? And even like that's the same thing as when I was talking about like people have different lever lengths. So people have different tissue conditions, people have different injuries, people have different like curvatures in their spine. People have like a different lean, they have different spirals in terms of how they, like everyone has like not everyone. A lot of people have like a mild scoliosis, I'd probably wager in some sense, because I play guitar with like one shoulder. I have a tendency to lean over to one side when I sit. Like I have a mild tendency towards one spiral direction or one, scoliotic position for the most part. Everyone just has a different spine, So saying there's one thing, and this is kind of this idea of like, we don't necessarily ascribe to one particular movement system. We've interviewed a lot of different people. We do like Goda's map for force transference in terms of a locomotive model. Like we like it as a map, and we like it as a map for movement practice and like an actual felt experience. There's a lot to be said for the lived experience of moving with Goda's movement map and locomotive map. But that doesn't mean that we don't apply other systems and don't apply other contexts. Like you said, FRC, which you could describe as controlled articulations of specific joints, is very, very useful. I have a ton of scar tissue in my right wrist from an injury from when I was a kid. And I do a lot of FRC in my right wrist specifically because I have so much scar tissue there. I have arthritic tendencies from having this scar tissue and playing guitar for 8 hours a day when I was a musician. And it's very useful. So it's a tool, but it's not my whole practice. Because if you're articulating your joints in this particular way, well, how do your joints actually articulate when you're looking at creating a pressure wave in maybe Goda's locomotive system, right?
Well, yeah, no, I agree with everything you're saying. Let's go with the principles here, saying that with FRC and with moving joints in particular, moving them a particular way will put stresses on certain joints just because of the mechanics. So it's very, very useful to know where the stresses are being put within your joints while you do certain movements. So especially as you get older, you're going to get, like, if you're working with someone who's 50, 60 years old and they're in pain, they're going to have arthritis in some places. So some people are going to be like, yeah, you need to have a anterior tilt, but they have arthritis in their joints. When they put the joints together, they hurt. Like, it's that simple, right? So you have to modify by, and I'm just giving you a specific example, by really, really finding out where is the sweet spot for your movement. Is it there? Is it there? Where can you tilt your pelvis in order to put the mechanics in the most favorable position? I'll give you another example. Someone with a disc herniation in their left side here, okay? At first, what I had to get them to do was to anterior tilt, so put their hips back, which puts more stress on the joints and less stress on the disc, and then tilt their hips towards the right so that it opened up the joint and the space in the right side of the spine, okay? So again, I wouldn't do that for a regular person because there'd be no point. You'd be putting more stress on the left side of your body. But I have to do it for someone in pain. So they're walking around with their pelvis shifted to one side like this. But temporarily, you need to relieve the pressure off the tissues. Otherwise, you're going to be in excruciating pain. So there's so much nuance to the actual mechanics of the joint when someone's hurt and when someone's rehabbing compared to a healthy person. So again, we have to separate these debates. And I see the research-based guys having such a low-level debate of flex or not flex in lifting. It's just like all the resources are being put towards these strength and conditioning type of mentality exercises, and not enough on the actual pressure waves, the actual movements in motion that are going to stop the bleeding. So that's why I like Goda again. It's stop the bleeding. Okay. I like FRC because when you're already hurt, you can get into specific positions perfectly. Okay. And I shouldn't even say I'm not licensed in FRC, I guess you can say. I just understand I use that language because what I'm doing is specifically moving a joint as to get the mechanics of the pressure into a certain position as to alleviate pressure in certain joints and put it more into others from positioning. Okay.
So if we're using up too many mental resources and research resources on exploring the seemingly arbitrary flex versus don't flex type of thing in lifting, let's define some of the things that you think in terms of like what would be a good use of research or debate ideas. Like what would be good topics of debate to kind of look into?
Again, like what we were saying before would be use observations to see the populations who don't get hurt so that we can stop the bleeding, so that we don't have to have these debates towards flexion extension. Really, it's about lifting because that's where the money is. That's where the people's minds are. It's like a cyclical thing, right? Like everybody thinks that that's how you get fit. So that's where the resources go. You're a research, let's say most of the research is done in a university setting with sports teams. What do they want? Faster, stronger. So that's where your resources are going to go. Now, through observation of nature and through observation, in the last 10 years, you have hundreds of YouTube videos of people getting injured and we can observe slow motion with iPads with precision versus in the lab they use kinematics, and that's only available to some people. So they've been looking at the, I'm going to say incorrect things, and incorrect, like the flexion extension, like jumping off a box and seeing if the leg moves in or out, versus actually looking at slow motion of open source injuries within the within YouTube, within, you know, on the internet, basically, because now there's thousands of them, and that technology is new. So we have to shift our focus into bringing it back to basically what GOTA does, right? Watch the injuries in slow motion, watch the correlations and the patterns that actually happen in real life, versus just going with your old models and trying to improve strength and conditioning and then extrapolating it towards rehab, towards getting stronger, towards getting buff. It's all melts into one at the end. Again, buff, stronger, faster, and rehab. Let's melt strength and conditioning and marry physiotherapy and strength and conditioning, because that's what's already popular. And if you come out against that, then you're just not as popular, right? You're not playing with the big dogs, because that's where the popularity is. So now, like, what we're doing is we're going, wait a second, maybe these guys that aren't credentialed are correct. So that's going to be a hard thing for credentialed people to come to grips with, right? That maybe they don't have the proper blueprint. Maybe the proper blueprint is walking and running. Maybe it is movement mechanics. Maybe it is stopping the bleeding versus just getting bigger and stronger.
So let's define the bleeding. What is the bleeding that they're stopping?
Well, like joint, easy, low-hanging fruit of getting into proper positions, like I showed you, right? So, no, like, people don't know that if you shift your hips way forward, you're going to put more pressure on the low back, right? This is here. You push
a mechanical
forward.
Reality.
Yeah, it's a mechanical reality. Easy mechanical realities that we're missing, like shifting your hip forward. Everybody's obsessed with, and I know this because I'm a chiro, right? So the field of physiotherapy, chiropractic, sports medicine is obsessed with what you should do with your pelvis. Is it an anterior tilt? Is it a neutral tilt? Is it a posterior tilt? When they're missing forward and backward shift of the pelvis, okay, as the low-hanging fruit, okay? And some people recognize it, but they don't get it completely on how easy it is to shift back and make the glutes the prime driver by fascial tensioning, not by muscle contracting. That's another thing. Muscle contraction is the model because it's a lever system that they're looking at. When it's a fascial system in reality that's driving things when you're in motion, but not so much when you're standing still. Again, GOTA was correct about the cadaver mechanics. Everybody's looking at things in a lever system because it was always cadaver mechanics. This lever makes sense when I'm standing still, but as, like, let's say a box or throw, it doesn't make sense anymore. And you can't even describe it with the language that they have right now that the academic world uses, because the planes melt into each other when you actually are in motion. The frontal sagittal transverse planes melt into each other and act more like gyroscopes. Again, GOTA's correct about that, right? Like, they act more like gyroscopes, and you can't separate the motions. You can try, but it's just not going to be very efficient to look at it that way. It's a rotary motions. There's rotary motions. There's spirals. There's reciprocations. There's fascial tensioning. There is all these are there's easy positions to get into as to make mechanical efficiencies a reality before you get injured. And the stability model that everyone uses right now, Stu McGill, almost everybody uses the stability models in one way or another, and they're still like, stay still as you rehab, relatively still, and that'll extrapolate into your movement. Trust me, bro. Right? Show me your fruit. Show me actually. So the proof is the papers for the scientific community, when really I want to see you actually take somebody and make them move better. And that's why I like Naughty's doing it with Johnny Ablin, you can see the difference in his movement. This is an MMA fighter. Okay.
Major way.
Yes. So that's the difference. Again, like you can see functional patterns within Johnny Ablin. He's changing his movement. He's showing the fruit. Okay. With the GOATA guys, you can see the difference in the run. Whether you think it's correct or not, it's up to you, but you can see them actually changing their mechanics. And I've done it myself too. Mm-hmm. With the WEC method guys, you can see them move much more efficiently. And the WEC method guys have beautiful movement in multiple planes of motion. They're showing their fruits as they move. Now, again, the lifting model, the rehab model is, trust me, bro, I got you stable. Your core is stable. You're good to go. Trust me. Right? So they're actually the ones that are making a leap of logic and leap of faith because they're not actually showing.
Well, it sounds like then one of the better uses of debate and uses of mental energy, and I actually see this happening within our community, is debating on what you're seeing in slow motion video, debating on what you're actually seeing when you're observing real motion. And I mean, that is why you have a dichotomy between functional patterns and WEC method and GOATA and one of a kind fitness, all looking at gait in a different way and all extrapolating what it means based on their own unique lenses, right? Like Naudi is very influenced by the lines of tension that Thomas Myers purported in anatomy trains. And GOATA is obviously creating their own language. One of a kind fitness has his interpretation. Devin Brown has his interpretation of the gait model. And so he's doing strength training in a way that he believes will not create compensations within that gait model, loading the glutes and internal rotation so that because that's what happens when you're in gait, essentially. Everyone has different sort of interpretations of what they're observing. And that's kind of where the debates happen. And they are happening. They're definitely happening. Maybe a little bit less between camps, because again, you have the issue of, big personalities who are asserting the supremacy of their particular system, and they don't necessarily want to debate. They're focused. And I actually think there is something to be said for not focusing on like arguing with other people and developing your own system. Like, I think there is something very powerful about focusing on yourself, staying in your own lane. That being said, I think figuring out what the first principles are and agreeing on first principles to then build upon is probably going to be a more important situation. Like, one of the things that I hear criticized about GOATA, for example, is that there's not enough emphasis on what's happening within the core. And just because they're observing some of these models of gait locomotion and these gait mechanics, they aren't training or accounting for some of the dynamic movements that are happening within the core. They're not really training that or addressing it. And if people have dysfunctions in it, is being put in a back chain and like practicing some of these like bows and corners and drop-ins and stuff. That's not going to actually do anything to correct dysfunctions through the midline. I think that's a pretty valid criticism. That's a criticism that comes mostly from functional pattern adherence, right? A lot of FP guys are like, well, even if they're right about some of this stuff, like, you're not looking at this, and this. They don't think it's nuanced enough, which, fair enough, man. Like, definitely, like I have experienced benefits and fruits from practicing GOATA patterns and doing some GOATA training. But I do a bunch of other stuff too, because again, like, GOATA doesn't talk about the decompression of the obliques, when I had like this hyper compressed sort of whole front line from years of doing CrossFit and gymnastics and bracing my core in a shortened position. Like, you need a specific approach. You need to have situational approaches to different dysfunctions, right? And so just having like, it could be a universal pattern. It could be like the most efficient way that we transfer energy as human beings. But when it comes to the application, what are the pieces that you're missing?
I completely agree with everything you're saying there. And that goes back to kind of like everyone's an individual at the end, right? It's almost, so the reason I like GOATA's approach off the start was it is stopping the bleeding. It's like, you don't need all this other stuff. I didn't need to lift 500 pounds. You know what I mean? Like, there was no, like, here's what I see all the time. I see jacked young guys come in to the office. Okay. They get hurt and they're like, I need to rehab so I can get back to that 500. You know what I mean? Or back to that heavy lift. Because once they hit the heavy lift, then they're good. You know what I mean? And then it becomes a cycle of injury. And this is what happened to me too. Getting back to it. Injury, getting back to it. So you're always rehabbing towards back to a heavier plateau of heavy lifting. And this is kind of the default. And that'll get you the muscles and the abs. And eventually during cutting season, you lose the fat and then you display your jackness, right? So that is a like kind of a circular model of getting nowhere because you're not developing any skills. You're not stopping the bleeding. You're not, it really is, you want skill development. You want to be able to move things and be able to have skills for later age. That's why I like movement. I don't exactly subscribe to, I like go to stop the bleeding approach. I'll work in internal rotation. I'll do functional patterns type motions. I'll do a lot of WEC method stuff where I'm switching sides and doing the north, south, east, west. I don't know if people know WEC method so much, but it's a lot of like switching angles and it's beautiful stuff, right? But I blend it all together and I find the best pieces and I put it into movement, which is a skill which I can carry into multiple sports and the rest of my life. And I do it within a blueprint of locomotion and respecting the joints. And I take FRC style particular motions and I use that to kind of gauge where I'm at. So for instance, I use a simple, I'll get into the back chain. Okay. So I'll push way back into a hinge and I'll just move my pelvis from side to side, kind of like I'm hitting someone with my pelvis, almost like a fish type of motion, right? Like that. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm back here.
Okay.
Okay. And because I'm in a posterior tilt like this, as I'm doing it, it's opening up the joints in the back. And when I go this way, when I go to the left, the right joints will open up. I can feel the tension there. When I go to the right, the left joints open up. I can feel the tension there. This morning, for instance, I just did 20. I could feel that my left side was tighter. It had more resistance. I went to the left a little bit more. It loosened up, and I'm good to go. I'm good to go do my movement, right? I don't need to do it that much. So that's what I find good about like the functional range or the very specific joint motions. Again, I'm not certified, so I'm just going to say because I know what happens mechanically as I move, I can do that a little bit, find out where my body's tense, feel what's what, and then go and do my thing.
It's almost more like fine-tuning your car before you go drive it, right? And I mean, like when you're talking about you want to be able to move, one of the things that we've talked about before and that I've been thinking about a lot is what are the movement practices that produce competent elders, physically competent elders? So the two ones that keep coming up for me are you see calisthenics, the old 70-year-old man in the park doing pull-ups and muscle ups and, still moving around pretty good. And these like 80-year-old Russian boxers, it's always old Russian men that I see online, right? Or like an old black dude at a park who's just like ripped beyond reason. It's like he's 70 years old and he's just like this jack dude's like, what's up? So thinking about that, it's like what movement practices produce physical competency well into old age. And then you look at guys like, like you see the documentary with Ronnie Coleman in the wheelchair and Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of looking like a sack of potatoes, still pumping iron, still doing his thing. But it's this is something that I kind of hit this point too, where you're talking about that cycle of injury. Same thing. I kind of hit my 500-pound deadlift and I was trying to push it a little bit higher. I'd get injured. And then I was like, okay, I'll try something else. I'll try to get stronger in the clean. And I got to like a 275-pound clean and I got my, like my 450 deadlift and I was like doing CrossFit and then I would get injured. And then it's like, okay, well, I'll rehab, get a little bit stronger, a little bit fitter, injure myself, keep going, a little bit stronger, a little bit fitter, injury. And that cycle, I just realized it's like, look, this has been going on for like fucking 10 years and I'm smart with my programming. I'm doing everything. I'm doing my mobility. I'm doing my stability. I'm progressive. This is all stuff that I can handle. I'm not training above like an 80% effort. Like I would injure myself doing stupid shit like warm-ups, like, 35 to 45% load squats or a front squat or an overhead squat or something like very, very light. is when I would, and I saw, I was like, there's no rhyme or reason to this. Like, I'm just doing these movements and I'm injuring myself. There's got to be a better way. And that's kind of, that's why I started getting into the ATG stuff. That's why I started getting into range of strength. I was still looking at it through the lifting lens. And it wasn't until realizing that I had to have a surgery, like that was something that was kind of, I was like, shit. Talking to you, you introduced me to Goda. You introduced me to this idea that there are more rotary patterns and rotational elements of movement. And I was like, fuck, I can't believe I didn't even think of this stuff. And maybe throw a medicine ball against a wall, but that was the extent of the rotation that I would ever try to do. And that was excruciating for me because I was just like this brick. I was like a brick all the time. So definitely getting out of that paradigm a little bit. I kind of actually, you know what, to be fair, I did go through like quite a big phase of Ito Portal stuff, and I was trying all the locomotion, but it was extremely unnatural and awkward to me. And even revisiting some of the Ito Portal stuff and some of the groundwork and some of that stuff while I'm trying to do more training to optimize gait and try to, have an efficient run so that I can enjoy running and that I can do some sprints and even apply it to some of my cycling mechanics, like when I'm on a bike. I found doing some of these crawling patterns and some of these deep squat patterns and even some of the gymnastics stuff. Like I've been doing 500 push-ups a day, every day, right? With a buddy of mine. And I keep getting this question, is it affecting your gait mechanics? It's like, yeah, of course it is. Like I'm doing 500 push-ups. I'm like in this shortened range in my pecs, and I have to do a lot of mechanical work so that I can have that nice arm swing back, and it doesn't affect that elastic bounce from when I'm side to side, creating that reciprocal energy transfer from back and forth. It has helped some stability. So when I'm full tilt, I'm full send in a sprint, I get that snap back a little bit more because that fascia along the anterior part of my pecs and everything, it's really tight. It's really elastic. So I'm swinging my arms back and it's snapping back like a rubber band, right? But it has definitely affected how smooth everything feels. Like before, I didn't have very big pecs. I didn't have I didn't have a lot of endurance necessarily. But I was efficient. I was smooth. Everything was just like easy. Now I kind of feel like it's like to swing my arm back. It feels like I almost have to fight to swing my arm back, and it just pops right back. So of course, to everyone who's in my Instagram DMs, like, is 500 push-ups affecting your biomechanics? Like, duh. Yeah, of course it is. I just have to do extra work for it. I'm just doing this challenge. And then when the 100 days are over, which I think we have like 30 days left, when that 100 days are over, I'm not doing it anymore.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Ito Portal because I do think it's a paradigm change. A lot of people have done that, right? Like a lot of people went to Ito Portal when he was hot, probably like 5 to 7 years ago, I would say. There was a big push. A lot of people went that way. I do think the ground-based stuff is very nuanced. You don't need to do it that much, and you need to do it very particularly because a lot of people are lacking that range of motion. So a lot of people think you just get down there and you'll eventually adapt to it. But I don't think it works like that. Even with the Kelly Starrett stuff where he's like, just get down for 30 minutes a day. I think that would have been a better application, 10 minutes a day for people to start. The lizard crawls and all that is a little bit too much. But I do think that there is a kind of a marrying of ideas there where even the Greg Lehman and the Andrew Locke saying that the hips being the prime mover and the hips having space is very, very key. Because once you lose that, you're compensating above and below. Okay? And especially internal rotation. Missing internal rotation is very key. So I think that there's a marrying of ideas there that hip space is very key. Now, how do you get that hip space? Is it to do more in internal rotation? Is it to get more space in the back of the hip? Right? I think FRC says more space in the back of the hip. I think someone like Devin Brown would say more internal rotation because that opens up the fascia or the muscles in the back. I'm not so sure if he says muscles or fascia. I think it's more fascia in the back, right? So I do a little bit of internal rotation as well. And then Goda says, Goda does the, what are they called? The rockers and the bow. That also opens up space in the back, but the marrying of ideas there is opening up space in the back of the hip, even with the lifting world. Do that so you have more space in the hips and you have to transfer less into your low back. Whether you think it's in the frontal plane or sagittal plane, or as you're in motion, either way, if you're missing hip motion and especially internal rotation, you're going to dump into your back. Okay. So there's a marrying of ideas there between kind of all of them. Now there's different applications. Like FRC is like very slow, controlled articular rotations. They're missing pressure wave. They're missing actual motion. They're missing applying it there. You could do FRC just to do FRC, and it's like you get better at it just like lifting. But what's the end goal? You're going to have, they would say you're building a hip, but they're missing the actual movement component. And
how much actual range of motion do you need in your hip for locomotion and for, a comfortable resting squat pattern? I would say almost like if you have appropriate fascial tensioning, you can access these patterns and you'll have a lot of stability and a lot of safety in your joints because you have the fascial integrity to support the actual system. You don't necessarily need to just articulate this like ball and socket over and over and over and over again. And again, I like that for like my wrist, for example. Like my wrist gets sore on the regs where the scar tissue is. And so I'll stretch the fascia out a little bit and I'll do a bunch of controlled articular rotations. And then my wrist starts to feel like a normal wrist. It doesn't feel like an all scarred up wrist anymore, and I can use it. And so that's very useful contextually, right? There's a lot of context that you have to apply to this stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's like putting motor oil in, like the synovial fluid. It's getting motion. However, it's not putting it into actual application of spirals, right? Like I like to do ropes because I can express those spirals. I like to do boxing because I can express the spirals in many different motions, right? And to me, that's prehab or rehab, right? Because I'm actually moving the joints as they're supposed to move. Walking and running is big. It doesn't have to be a fast run. I like longer, slower runs where I can still express the motions of my body, but it's not at a high pace where everything has to go to its max. Now, with FRC, they would say, kind of the same argument that I heard, I think Devin Brown say, maybe I'm straw manning. I don't know. I shouldn't say like what other people are saying, but I've heard it's you build the attributes so that you can go use it in whatever you want. I think that FRC personally does better in like jujitsu where it's not locomotion. It's like you actually need those ranges of motion because the same, like the controlled articular rotation, imagine getting in an arm bar. You now have that range of motion. You've now felt that your nervous system will say, I'm not going to shut off. And I can move my body around that where it's not so good in application towards mechanics because they're missing the fact that it's a pressure wave, it's a rotary motion, and it's fascial driven, not so much slow controlled articulation.
One example, I was trying to think of an example that would illustrate the attributes idea. Remember when we were watching that video of Elliot Kichobe? And we were noticing that he was like inside ankle bone low, and yet he had this fascial integrity that allowed him to bounce, right? Like he was flying. His fascial integrity is his attribute, right? So he might not have the byproduct of a good, bow and corner or like an inside ankle bone high position where he's efficiently transferring that, off the bony bridge of his foot necessarily, but he has the attributes of fascial integrity and bounciness. I mean, he has that spiraling ability, right? So he has that attribute within him. We even said it's like, well, we'd rather have the fascial integrity than an inside ankle. Like if I was a runner, I would rather have that than, not have that and be inside ankle bone high.
Absolutely.
So that's, so to a degree, like you can actually have suboptimal positions for energy transference while also having attributes that protect your body and create, a different level of how your body handles force transference. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can just have, all like, again, movement optimism, where you can just progressively train whatever pattern and it'll automatically make you bulletproof. Like this idea of bulletproofing your joints with an ATG split squat. And then you get all these people, you hear a lot about the people who do really, really well with it, but you don't hear about all the people who have knee injuries from doing ATG, right?
Yeah.
Because, they get blocked.
So. Yeah, no, for sure. Like there's a lot of that, right? Like haters of FP will be like, did you hear about this guy who got injured from FP? It's like, did you hear about all the people who did well from FP.
Reverse
It's like,
scoliosis and
yeah,
like healed their back pain. And here's the thing that I was thinking about this. I wanted to bring this up actually. One of the biggest things that people like to do is they like to post screenshots of like, I used to be in FP and now I'm in GOTA. It's like, I used to be in GOTA and now I'm in WEC method. Fucking, we talked to Tim Sheaf. Tim was in functional patterns, got a GOTA recode, and now he's full tilt into WEC method. It doesn't matter. Like, there's going to be like, everyone is an individual. They are going to find movement practices that are contextually relevant for their body and their journeys. And there is no one ultimate system. Everyone should aspire to make their system the one ultimate system. I think that is a good aspiration to do, because it forces you to look at a lot of complex problems with nuance and integrity. But the reality is, like, egos aside, no one thing is for everyone. I hate to say it, guys. Like, sorry.
Well, I kind of disagree with that and agree with it at the same time. Like, it depends who you are, right? Like, for me and for us, I have I've looked into so many different systems that I have from doing that in the past, I understand the models. So I understand where they intersect and where they go against each other, which is why we have the podcast, right? Like, we're talking about that sort of thing, right? So it's not for everybody. Not everybody can go that deep with it. Some people get into a certain system and they're like, this is the one for me, right? And then some people, for one or another reason, get into a system and it's not for them. Let's say, for instance, somebody gets into GOTA and they go into an anterior tilt or like a one of a kind, and they go into an anterior tilt with their pelvis and they're like, ow, that hurts my back. But it's only because they have like a slight inflammation or a issue with one of the joints in their lumbar spine. They could have used FRC style principles right before that to work that out so that they were good to go in that new system. Do you know what I mean? So there's a lot of nuances towards that.
I was even thinking, like the GOTA thing that that Nathan from MoveMed was criticizing was this idea that you're going to be neurotic and you're going to be like, overly flexing in these certain positions, right? And I actually caught myself more than a year into doing GOTA workouts, actively flexing in these positions. And only in the last month or two, I've learned to start relaxing and put my joints in these positions to naturally create tensions, as opposed to forcing tensions. Because again, like, my lifting background was, how much can I irradiate? How much can I actively flex these muscles to force to create force and to generate tension? And trying to release that tension and allow my body to have more efficiency in these patterns. Like, I watched some old videos of myself doing some biomech workouts, and I'm grimacing and I'm like, it looks like I'm doing a max effort lift. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is my conditioning. This is the thing that I've conditioned my body to naturally do. I'll feel a bit of tension and I'll flex it. I'll squeeze it. I'm going to try to feel it as much as I can. Mind muscle connection, man, like, as much as I can. I used to do that in yoga even. I was like, like stretching my arms out as much as I could, like counter force in Warrior 2, and twist as hard as I can into this posture. Everything was yang energy. And so, if a person is going into these biomechanical practices, they need to learn how to relax if they're coming from a lifting background. If they're learning, if they come from this irradiation and this like literally hardcore mentality, I was still squeezing my core to try and get more access into a drop in. As soon as I relaxed and I got myself in the right position and I just like articulated, I was like, oh wow, this is this is what it's supposed to feel like.
Yeah,
it's supposed to be more efficient.
To be fair to GOTA, like, they're not saying to do that, but
no, they aren't.
That could be an issue going in, right? So, and there's also, not everybody's gonna. Let's say we do think GOTA is the ultimate, and there's nothing else. Not everybody's going to access it that way. They might access it like, you have to go by steps. I had to go into steps. Like, when I was in CrossFit, even going from like powerlifting and bodybuilding to CrossFit was a step. Right? It was a weird step, because it's like, you're going to get less strong, but I justified it like, I'm going to be able to have more skills. So cool. Right? And then going from CrossFit to like Ido Portal, that was a huge step. But would I have been able to go from CrossFit to like a WEC method or GOTA right away, or an FP? Probably not. I needed that intermediate step. So everyone's going to assess things a little bit differently, and they might need to hit an ATG before they go to, you know, a GOTA or something like that.
I did.
Yeah, like a lot of people will find their way to different systems, irrelevant of whether one system is better than the other, right?
I think the funniest thing that I did while I was like in that in between phase was I was trying to do an ATG drop in, so I was getting my knees way over my toes and trying to drop in at the same time. It was a disaster. Like don't do that, guys. It's bad. It's messy. But yes, you definitely need an intermediate. I think the exploration of these movement practices and these training systems are very useful. But to make it the core of your entire practice and to specialize in anything, Edo Portalis is the best. The more you specialize, the bigger the price you have to pay. Right? So,
absolutely.
I think these biomechanical approaches really offer the benefit of having a generalist approach to movement, or at least an approach to movement that kind of considers the way that the native functions of the human body: walking, running, throwing, standing, etc. It's posture focus, it's locomotion focus, it's throwing focus. If you approach the body in that way, you can generalize and approach your specific problems with the nuance and context that it requires your thinking to approach it from. On that note, I have to wrap this up. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that we're like over an hour already. This was episode 83 of The Art of Move, I do believe. So thank you for listening, guys. We'll catch you on the next episode. And thank you, as always, for listening. If you're listening on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what you thought. Let us know if there's things that you agree with or disagree with. You can find me at The Body Moves on Instagram. You can find Will at The Art of Move. We'll catch you on the next episode of The Art of Move podcast. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, let's do a part 2 to this one, because I got to one out of like 20 clips. Because it really does show the lack of evidence towards how to lift, basically, or what lifting actually does within your body. There's no evidence for it. It's not out there. It doesn't exist. Everybody thinks it's there. It's not there. We will show this in part 2.
Absolutely. Keep an eye out, guys. We'll let you know when it's coming out.
Have a good one.
That was great.
Yeah, I thought it was good. It started off kind of slow, but I thought it went, like, always when you listen back, you're like,
yeah, we picked up, man. We picked up. I thought it was pretty decent. I always get really bored talking about lifting debates. Like, immediately I get bored talking about lifting debates. I'm like, at this moment where it's like, why are we listening to these guys debate about lifting? and then I saw the overarching point where it's like, oh, it's because they don't know what they're talking about.
I really want to show because everybody has that in their head, that there is evidence, all this evidence out there for squats, for deadlifts. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And they're saying it themselves. So I really want to expose that.
I'm pumped.
Because nobody's going to be able to come out afterwards. We can clip it and be like, oh, really? Your guy says there's not. Right? So, yeah, it's important. Let's do one ASAP. I'll even do it tomorrow if you want.
Yeah, I could do one tomorrow. I'm teaching a class at 10:30 in the morning till 11:30, and then I might have another call. But let's, we could definitely do one tomorrow.
We'll do last minute. Just let me know.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Have a good one, man.
Yeah, you too. I'll talk to you soon.
Take it easy.